With this panel, our objective is to talk about Israel and current events. And the way we're going to organize is this first hour. Each of our panelists will take about 15 minutes in presenting kind of their summary of what's going on. Bob had an advantage. He got a whole hour this morning before anybody else. But after that's done, I'll do the introduction, and then we'll have each of them. We'll take just a kind of a short break, and then we'll get into some specific questions that have been submitted from you, and I have a list of them as well. And so hopefully this is going to be beneficial for everyone as we discuss this and put in perspective where we should be looking at things where we are today. I got to stand up, sorry. I'm good, I'll stand up, yeah, it's fine. If we go back to October 7th, of course, for the Israelis, that was called the worst day in history. And Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, described Hamas as the new Nazis, saying that this was the worst day since the Holocaust. Palestinians, on the other hand, they saw this as a plan to remove them from Gaza. And the idea has surfaced even in the current Israeli government and no secret that the Palestinians don't want a compromise. They want all of Israel. So that's a dilemma we have. Let's just look at a little bit of history here, trying to look at a broad line. 1919, when Ben-Gurion was the prime minister, he said, there is an abyss between us, them and the Arabs, the Palestinians, and nothing can fill that abyss. Now, that's pretty foresighted because I think probably some of that exists today. The whole point was you could manage this, you could limit it, you could contain it, but you couldn't resolve it. And I think we're seeing testimony to that, a lot of that today. Remember when the British Mandate was issued back in that time, 17, 18, 19. The British Mandate gave only 17% of the land to the Jews, and 75% was go to the Arabs. But of course, that didn't work out. Didn't want that. That shows you a testimony of where this battle began. It began at the very beginning of things. Of course, in 1948, when the nation of Israel was established, 750,000 Arabs fled, and they went to the West Bank, to East Jerusalem, to Gaza. And Israel, of course, in that war, remember, it was talked about this morning, they lost 1% of their population, 6,000 people. 600,000, most of them Holocaust survivors, had come out. In 1949, the so-called Green Line was drawn by the United Nations and others, or what was prior to that. The Green Line was a green pencil that was drawn across a map that drew the boundaries, and then Gaza became under the protectorate of Egypt at that time, and the West Bank was annexed by Jordan. So he had this conflict there again. Move forward to 1956, we start seeing the Suez crisis that came out. Israel invaded Egypt to prevent in a preventative war, and they took Gaza at that time. The Sinai Peninsula that was taken was given back some years later, and I remember Brother George Tabak always felt that was prophetic because he said that wasn't to be part of Israeli land. Jump forward to 1965, Ben-Gurion resigned at that point, or 1963, sorry. Ben-Gurion resigned and he left Israel with a fairly weak leadership. At that point, there was not much going on in that leadership to strengthen Israel's capacity. 1966, a lot of Jews actually left Israel at that point. More of them left Israel in 66 than came in because of what had happened there. So the question becomes whether that could happen again. In fact, that was funny. If you'd have gone through the Tel Aviv airport at that time, you would have seen a sign that said, with the last person leaving the country, please turn out the lights. But it was fairly bad at that time. Then the 67 war came, and it kind of reinforced the tensions with the Arabs at that point. They still wouldn't recognize Israel. And every few years, you had the intifadas, the wars, in other words, with the Arabs one way or other. In 79, then we had finally a peace with Egypt that was, no land was forfeited in that, and that's why we had this settlement with Egypt, and you may remember those famous pictures with Jimmy Carter and others on that 79. In 1994, we had peace with Jordan come in. And both countries abandoned, at that point, East Jerusalem, the Gaza, and the West Bank to the Palestinians. So that goes all the way back to 1994 in that Jordan peace agreement. So things have been going back and forth. The problem perennially becomes the Palestinians say that they have no identity. That was always the issue, that there was they wanted a separate identity. And I think, as many know, Palestinian wasn't even a name at that point. It was just Arabs. But that was always an issue. And it became more of an issue as Hamas was organized. And that arm of the Palestinians that would now take a new look at Israel. And remember all the work that was done to try to put them in a forefront in front of the United Nations. It's still see those pictures of what's his name getting up there. Isn't that terrible? I don't have it written down. Arafat, thank you. Senior moment. Okay, Arafat getting up and talking about it and pounding his fist just like Khrushchev did. It's really strange. So let's talk about Benjamin Netanyahu for just a minute, because he's come under great fire with this. Netanyahu doesn't believe there is a solution. He accepted the Hamas takeover as a way of the lesser of perhaps two evils. There's been a lot of talk about the 2020 Abrahamic Accords, and I know some brethren have said that, it was a sign of progression and what would happen. But the problem with the Abrahamic Accords, the Palestinians saw it as a weakness. And in fact, all the Arabs saw this as a way we can resolve the issues if we go into an alignment here on the Accords. Here was the problem. When you have corrupt leaders, it becomes very difficult. I don't know if you remember all the Feed the World stuff that happened back in the late 70s. And remember, we had all the singers get together that did the Coke commercial and said, we're going to do all this work. And everybody collected money and they bought the goods to go to the poor in Africa at that time. And what happened to them? They all rotted on the piers because they wouldn't bribe the officials to distribute it to the people. That's what happened here. Those accords allowed the bribing of Hamas leaders. Qatar was one of the big ones that tried to bribe the Hamas. And instead of giving that to the people, those dollars were packed in suitcases and they went to Hamas, which used then it to build tunnels and buy weapons. Hamas used the money, acquire weapons, tunnels, and one of the things that was mentioned in this whole recent to-do is the fact that they have the greatest underground fortress that anywhere in the world, funded by all this money that came out of the Abrahamic Accords and the agreement to fund certain things. History shows that there's been nothing, and I just give you a brief overview of this conflict and feudal peace plans that have taken place. President Trump, when he was in 2020, he came up with what he called the deal of the century. You know, I used to love politicians. I told some people, remember a politician, Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. They've got one objective only. That's to get reelected. And if you think that's not it, then you're kidding yourself, because that's exactly what they want. And they will go to the point where they can make that happen by making certain deals. Well, the proposal, it was just ended up being another fantasy that didn't happen. Biden's plan, the Biden administration, no better. Everything happened. Israel is really doomed in the long run, as you know, the support comes from the political side, not for the spiritual side, not for the protection side. The support for Israel by either side comes as political maneuvers. So what's the conclusion of all this? Only my conclusion is, in fact, not just me, I saw this in writing, only a catastrophe of biblical proportions can persuade either side. Well, that says a lot about where we are. And there could be a lot more said in this, but I think right now we're going to move into our presentations, and we'll talk more about this maybe in the second hour as we deal with the questions. So Brother Bob Goodman is going to be up first with his, then we'll go to Brother Jim Parkinson, and lastly Brother David for his presentation. And then after those, we'll just have them follow each other, and then I'll be back up at the end.
My thoughts are entitled God's People in the News, and really, you know, this was a great assignment. We started to look at this panel about the 1st of October of last year, and I thought, oh, this is going to be really tough, and it's been a wild ride, as all of us know. You know, we're told to watch and wait, and that's what we're all doing. That's why we're here. And just a reminder, we're not prophets, we are observers, and so I'm going to give you my observations, and they're going to be a little different, I know, than either Jim's or David's. So we have a lot of diversity in the panel. I'm going to look at some of the political and strategic things that are happening, and then hopefully the others will help us tie those into current prophecy. And of course, we know everything started in October 7th. We know about hundreds of rockets that hit Israel, kidnappings, military posts overtaken, civilians used as shields, really an ugly situation. And the Israelis, of course, mobilized massively and began bombings and invasions into Gaza. They were attacked on multiple fronts, and they resisted. In the typical Israelis' evaluation, they probably think this was a military failure, at least to start with, because they were caught unawares. So that was a bit of an embarrassment. And of course, the world response has been interesting. The U.S. and British allies have supported Israel. The UN has condemned the response, and there are a lot of humanitarian protests as well. And that continued. You know, when I looked at the news sheet, it was just solid. Every day there was multiple things coming out for several months. But then on April 13th, something else happened, and it was a big something. Iran sent over, I think it was over 320 rockets, drones, and ballistic missiles to try to demolish Israel. And that's one of the things I'm going to talk about a little more. The Israeli response, as well as the coalition's response, was interesting, and they largely repelled those attacks. And it was interesting looking back. Israel actually had supporters in this counteroffensive. That was United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. They provided intelligence, advanced intelligence, that the attack was going to happen. And then the US, UK, and I think even France got involved in the air defense, as well as Israel, and even Jordan helped shoot down drones. This is unprecedented. And this was not, Saudi Arabia doesn't have a treaty with Israel, and yet they were involved on this. So this is, when you see this kind of thing happen, it's a red flag. Look, something unusual has happened here, and how can we apply this to Bible prophecy? And of course, the world's response is the Allies have stood fairly firm, although critical of humanitarian needs and other things. And of course, in the United States and now starting worldwide, we're getting a lot of college protests for human rights in Gaza. And unfortunately, a lot of those are actually at least nuanced anti-Semitic. So this is something for us to watch. And there's been many thousand deaths and wounded, and over 133 hostages still remain. So here's some things that we as Bible students should be very clear on when we talk to others. Hamas started the war. Period. That's a fact. Hamas can end the war by releasing the hostages and negotiate, but they have chosen not to. Israel is seen as an oppressor. That's how they're painting it, but that's not the case. I mean, Hamas can shut down the offensive, and they can turn over the remaining hostages and negotiate, and this thing can be ended, but they're not willing to do that. Hamas embedded children, women, and civilians in the infrastructure where they knew they would be bombed. So it was hospitals and schools and other things. And a summary of this would be the Arabs hated Israel more than they loved their children. That's the basic premise, which makes this a horrible humanitarian situation. Just horrible. Another basic fact in the Middle East, nobody wants the Palestinians. Look at Saudi Arabia. They have a tremendous amount of land area. They could allocate land area to the Palestinians. I'm sure that Israel would provide desalination so they could have water, and they could be set up, but nobody wants them. Nobody wants them. We'll talk about that in a sec. Israel's purpose in this war, right off, they stated they were going to destroy Hamas. They're going to eliminate that terrorist group in Palestine, and that continues to be their purpose. So we should be clear on what's happening in the background and not necessarily listen to all the propaganda and noise. But we understand that Israel is obviously under divine protection. So we're going to look at three basic prophecies: living in unwalled villages, being the apple of God's eye, and all of her lovers leading her. I think in my own mind, I know as I looked at these, traditionally I had very simple thoughts as to what these were. But now looking at what has happened since October 7, my thoughts have changed, and the meanings are more nuanced. So we all know about the headlines. Hamas says that an attack was a necessary step, and that's what they took on October 7th. But on April 13th of this year, there was an Iranian missile attack, and the war changed from a war against Hamas to a war against Iran. Now, there was great concerns amongst the whole world that this would escalate into a bigger war, but then Iran attacked Israel unsuccessfully, but the dynamic changed. Now, why Iran? Well, Iran is the funder and the sponsor of Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. They fund them. They provide military supplies and so forth. And this is so that if you look at it, Israel is boxed in on all sides. Very interesting. So we need to be clear when we talk about these terrorist groups, these are extension of Iran's policies because they fund them, they support them, they supply them. And so, we all know what happened with over 320 drones, cruise and ballistic missiles coming in, and they were repelled. I hope Jim talks some more about this, the miracle that occurred on April 13th. Because remember, Jim said that Iron Dome is over 90% effective. That means 9 rockets are repelled, 1 gets in. So there should have been about 32 or 33 rockets that got in, but there was only 3. And of those, there was only one, what they call casualty. It wasn't a death, but there was a child that was severely injured by shrapnel from a rocket. That's a miracle. And then to compound that, you had Jordan, you had the United States, you had UK, you had Israel, all in this defense unified effort to protect Israel and to shoot down these rockets and drones. Now, anytime you get a coordinated response like that, unless you practice, it never works very well, right? Because of coordination and miscommunication and just not knowing what the other's doing. Yet in this instance, 3 missiles. The Houthis even launched drones from Yemen towards Israel. So truly they were surrounded on all sides. Pretty amazing. And then on April 23rd, 10 days later, Hezbollah tried to initiate an aerial attack on Israel. And of course, they're up in Lebanon. So they've been hit from all sides. Now, very interesting. What was shown here is in the midst of it, Israel had military superiority to all of these foes. And of course, we know that's no surprise because God is intervening for them. And when we look at it, these are the terrorist groups that are around, including Syria, where Assad is funded by Iran as well. Kind of interesting. So they made some strategic misconceptions. Israel can't repel attacks on multiple fronts at once. False. Israel's supporters would not intervene and help. False. In fact, Saudi Arabia came in and gave them advanced intelligence without even having any kind of formal agreement with them. And Israel can't sustain the attack. False. It's been going on since October 7th. So Iran is the major sponsor of terrorism in this region. So although we talk about the groups, Hezbollah, Hamas, and Houthis, and Syria, it's all of these together. They're representing the sponsor of this terrorism, which is Iran. And Iran's position is to destabilize this portion of the world. Now, on this map, there are 2 groups of Muslims, Sunni and Shia. So in the light green is the Sunni areas, in the dark green is Shia. And there's a fundamental difference when the prophet went away, Muhammad, there was a difference as to whether his nephew should be the successor and therefore have kind of like a succession, or whether it should be not family oriented. And that was the nature of the dispute. And so the Sunnis said, no, we're gonna elect our leaders, and the Shia went through a hereditary line. And this bitter split goes down 14 centuries, so it's still there today. They don't get along. But what you notice is, look at the terrorist groups, where they are, and who their sponsors are. And they're in dark green. It's all the Shias. So what we're seeing here, although most will not say this, is really a struggle within Islam between the Sunni and the Shia. And the Sunnis realize if they want stability, they're not going to get that from the Shia. The Shia are really disruptors. And Micah 7:16 says, the nations shall see and be confounded at their might. That's kind of the situation we're seeing right now in Israel. They're confounded. They're sitting back. So you've got everybody from Morocco, across all of Africa, Saudi Arabia, and they're confounded that Israel is standing alone. And of course, we realize that the reason for this is they are the apple of his eye. They're the apple of God's eye. And even in the days of old, they realized you need to be near Israel rather than opposing them, because God is fighting for them. And we're seeing that today. Now, Muslim involvement, here's the Arab Barometer. So this is something from the Arab News Channel. Over 90% of the Arabs disapprove of extremist group and condemn acts of terror. Now, whether this is really effective or not, I don't know, but it's interesting the distribution of Shia and Sunni is about 90 and 10. So most of the Muslims want a stable world where they can build and prosper, and they realize this other faction is disruptive. Here are the countries that they have agreements with, and they also had an agreement with Turkey, which has been suspended because of the humanitarian issues in Gaza, but they say as soon as that's resolved, they'll resume trade and relationships. So some have agreements. Most Sunnis are not involved in the conflict and haven't really commented. So they're watching and waiting. They're seeing what's happening. All of them desire stability. All of them are kind of in an uneasy alliance, but Israel is emerging today as the superpower of the Middle East. It used to be a question of whether Iran or Israel. And clearly Israel is showing through God's help that they can perform. We have this statement about all of her lovers leaving her. And, we had thought that meant no one would be an ally anymore. But what we see is people are distancing themselves, but they're not necessarily divorcing themselves. So they have alliances, and there's a tenuous peace, which is consistent with one of our questions about, they'll say peace, peace, and there's no peace, seemingly a conflict. But one thing that's for sure is in the long term, Israel's place, and as Len said, is political, is they are losing popularity. It's because of the young people. And it's not just the United States, it's worldwide. And infiltrated within these groups are, there's propaganda about, and it's anti-Semitic. So I'll leave on the thought that our rulers today are fairly firm in being staunch allies of Israel, but the rulers are 10 years from now are on college campuses.
That the time of trouble, which I believe that certainly we're in it, is mentioned 4 times in Jeremiah. I'll mention them. Chapter 2, verses 27 and 28, 11, 12, and 14:8. The Jacob's trouble is mentioned in chapter 30, verse 7. Now, I will suggest, since Jacob's trouble is mentioned only this once in the entire Bible, and it's in the full expression of the time of Jacob's trouble, that it represents Israel's part in the time of trouble. Now, whether that began in the 1870s or when it began with World War I, 1914, that might be a consideration that people might want to consider one way or the other. Some think otherwise, and that's, after all, and they think that it's only the end-time event that's referred to by the time of Jacob's trouble. But so much for that. How much detail does the Scripture give us for the events of Israel's return? So we turn to Ezekiel chapter 37 for that. That shows us the valley of dry bones, the return of Israel. In the valley of dry bones, when we get to the skin, that suggests to me that those are definable boundaries. And that suggests the Israel independence of 1948. In Exodus 10, verse 7, this is now after 4 plagues have taken place. Now, I personally think that the 4th of the plagues, 7 last plagues of Egypt, is representing World War II. So after that, so Pharaoh's servants intercede in favor of Israel. That is, they tell Pharaoh, why don't you let them go, because we're in miserable straits here on account of all of these plagues. And so he does give them a limited amount of leash. So that might also suggest that The intercession of Pharaoh's servants came in 1948 with the independence of Israel. A third place to look for information about Israel's return and at the time of Jacob's trouble is in Psalms 83, and now a number of brethren have turned to that. In verses 2 through 8, there are only two non-Semitic tribes that are mentioned. First is the Philistines, Hamas in Gaza. The other is Tyre, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Let's watch and see. Little history on the Philistines from Genesis chapter 10. That originally they came out of Egypt, I think is the Casluhim, or Caphtorim rather, and they settled in Crete. That was the Minoan civilization. But it was destroyed about the same time as the plagues, and it was taken over by Greeks afterwards. But because of the explosion of the volcano Thera, or Santorini, they got off the island and they went to where some of their previous ancestors had gone, to southwest Israel, or what's now Gaza. Tyre, that's the Tiras of Genesis 10, which is from Japheth, whereas the Philistines came from Ham. Now, in verses 9 to 11, I think we have both of those as pictures of Armageddon. Again, we go back to the Judges for some of that. I think because of time, I'll not go into that in more detail, though. Satan, Iran, and most governments hate Jews and hate Israel. I express my own opinion. From the river to the sea, Israel will always be. Now, Iran's hostility to Arabs causes many of the Arabs to lose their hostility towards Israel. And that's suggested by Ezekiel 38:13, where Sheba and Dedan are Arabia. The predominant country of that, of course, is Saudi Arabia. And in verse 13, Arabia is to be at the head of the Western Bloc. Do we see that they have the stronger influence among the Arab nations? Of all the nations in the Arab world, is Saudi Arabia not the strongest? But there are more. Now, we can see the Eastern Bloc of Ezekiel 38 forming. Iran in 1979, Turkey's in the process of changing sides, and many of these other countries are alienating from the West. So we see this taking place. Well, I think that the 7 last plagues of Exodus show the major world events spanning the harvest, and the 7 last plagues of Revelation show the effects these events have on Babylon. Now, I don't know anywhere in Scriptures that details the Sinai War of 56 or the Six-Day War of 67, the Yom Kippur War of 73, and so forth. There's a list of them that one can find on the internet. However, the major world events, or plagues I will suggest, have each contributed one major step towards the restoration of Israel. Now is a good time to change the slide. Each one has contributed a major step towards the restoration of Israel ever since the 1870s. I'll just comment that the Long Depression that started in 1873, it is the first truly major worldwide event since Noah's flood. So we're talking about over 4,000 years. So something changed then. The transportation was available. The product of the Long Depression was Petah Tikva. That was 1878, November 3rd, when they finally arrived at the site. And then the first Aliyah began in 1882. That's what the Long Depression brought. We could go into more detail if we had more time, but we don't. Then we come to World War I. It brought about the Balfour Declaration of a homeland for the Jewish people. Then we come to the 1930s and the Great Depression. It drove the Jews from Germany. I'll name an exception, maybe sometime in private conversation, but just skip it for time. World War II came, and the Jews were driven not just from Germany, but from Central Europe generally. After World War II, right away began the Cold War of the East versus West. You may recall that this fifth of the 7 last plagues in Egypt was an east wind that brought locusts into all the borders of Egypt until a mighty west wind came and drove them all away again. The result of that was driving the Jews from Eastern Europe. Fully 1 million Jews have left Russia in that era. Of course, not all of them went to Israel. A lot of them did come to the U.S. and a few other countries. Now, I will suggest that what's indicated for the next major world event, it may well be COVID-related and vax-related, but will be a deep depression because it suggests that the river Euphrates is to be dried up. So if they are driven from the west, that's where the main concentration of non-Israeli Jews is. There'll be no place other that they need to be driven from. So Armageddon will come, and that's when Israel's enemies will be destroyed, all of them. A lesson for us is, as the anti-Jewish bandwagon builds up, just stay off it. And then I think we've already heard some, I'm short on time, so we'll get on to. Okay, I can. It's already been mentioned that on April 1st of 2024, the Israel bombed and killed 2 Iranian generals. It was not in the Iranian embassy. It was in a business building which was not on the embassy property. But response to that on April 13 is when Iran launched 170 drones, more than 30 cruise missiles, more than 120 ballistic missiles. That's between them and the Hezbollah and Yemen. They were launched from Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and Yemen. As has been mentioned, 99% were intercepted. Here was a totally untested system requiring cooperation from 5 different countries, maybe more, never tested before, and it had to all operate as one man, and it did. Of the 3 missiles that came through, one, I was told it was once a Druze girl, another time that it was a Bedouin girl, but it could have been a Bedouin of the Druze religion. She was hospitalized, but I think I have heard that she has since been dismissed from the hospital. The other 2 created only minor damage. It's almost incredible that an untested defense system with 5-country cooperation should be so successful. As one retired Israeli scientist said, "If that's not a miracle, I don't know what is."
Well, what am I supposed to say here? I do love you. When it comes to prophecy, I'm on the outer fringe. And I don't mean necessarily with what it means. I mean the way you interpret it. I'm sure you realize we all think differently. Let me just use one simple example about perspectives. Not just prophecy, but in your whole way that you run your thinking processes. Some of us see a big picture and then hang all the details on it. That's what Chart of the Ages is. Brother Russell said, there's no way you're going to see the whole Bible at once, but I'm going to give you the whole Bible at once on one page. Now you can hang all the detail on it you want. And if you understand that big overview, everything's going to fit once you're done. So that's the way some of us think. I'm that kind of thinker. I like a big picture, and where does this detail go? But equally valid, it's just not me, are those of you who think the other way. I've got 3,500 details here, and I start sewing a tapestry out of them and end up with something quite lovely. Hopefully, what I do, like the chart, and what you do with your tapestry is going to end up with the same story. If so, we have the word of the Lord behind it. Okay, that's kind of a little introduction here to what this whole panel is doing. There are dangers of oversimplification. But if you're a big picture type like me, you oversimplify. So I'll make mistakes, and you can call me on them, and you may be right. I change my mind. I do not I have no problem admitting that I changed my mind. I think I would stop thinking if I didn't change my mind. So there are dangers of oversimplification, but there are also dangers of the lack of simple overview. In other words, if you don't have this simple overview, it's really easy to get caught in current events. That's the title of this panel. By the way, I didn't look at my watch when I started, so pull on my coattails. Just an example. You could focus on Hamas's sufferings. Most of the world's doing that. That's what got all that uproar going. Oh, these poor little kids, they're being bombed and they're starving to death. And that's terrible. But by the way, God is an equal opportunity distress distributor. If you get in the way of the Lord's chariot, you're going to get run over. We can say, Old Testament, God said to Jews, go in and wipe them all out. Well, that's exactly what's happening right now. And everybody goes, oh! Horrors! They seem to have forgotten their Old Testament. That doesn't mean you don't have sympathy for those people. But the fact is the Lord's chariot is building Israel for the kingdom. You get in the way of that and you're going to get crunched. That's part of the big picture. Don't worry about the fact that 25,000 people got smashed in Hamas, in Gaza. You can worry about it on a humanitarian basis, but sure you're not going to worry about it as far as the Lord's plan is concerned. It's the prophecy that is important, not the sufferings. Israel was in the way of the Lord's chariot at the first advent. The Lord was an equal opportunity distributor of misery there. He chased them out of their land, and they'd been out of it for 2,000 years. He doesn't care whether it's Jew or Hamas. You get in the way of the Lord's chariot, he's going to crunch you. Okay. Prophecy on this panel is dealing with the march of progress from 1878 to the dotted line. That's the point of our discussion. So I'm kind of a conscientious objector here about Israel and current events, because we do love to open the newspaper or the TV or whatever, the computer, and oh, what happened there today? And you can get all excited about it. I'm simply asking you, can you hang it on the chart? Or are you just getting excited about it? Okay, the big picture, and this has been done by my brethren here already, so I'm going to be a little repetitive, except I'm going to bring it down to 5 parts. 1878 to the New Covenant's making. 5 parts. 1, Israel was established in the land in 1878. 2, the Lord knocked the Gentile foot off the land, 1914. That, by the way, is the interpretation of Gentile times. You put much more than that on it, and you're going to get in trouble. Brother Russell got in trouble because of that. Number 3, God says he'll purge out the rebels. Oh, this is important to this panel. Just because it's happening to Israel doesn't mean it's happening to Israel. A lot of Israel is of no interest to the Lord. They're rebels. It's like the first advent. How much of Israel did Jesus care about? Well, he cared about all of it. But as far as he was concerned, which ones was he aiming at? The remnant. It's no different now. If you look at Israel as a block of rock, you're going to misinterpret prophecy. Okay, that's 3. Israel established, Gentile foot off, purge out the rebels. That's long process. Number 4, disable hostile neighbors. That's Psalm 83. Psalm 83 is basically about disabling the enemies that surround Israel geographically close. Number 5, disable the rest of the world. And that's Ezekiel 38 and 9. That, I think, is the 5 points of Israel in our day. Current events can get you really off base. Okay, Psalm 83. There are brethren that think Psalm 83 is a one-time event. There are brethren like me who think it's a whole period of events. Let me explain why. If I can get my Bible open. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here. By the way, I cannot over-appreciate the work that Brother Jim has done on who's who in all of these names. Not only here, but in other parts of the Bible. But I do have a little perspective difference, and I'm not settled on this in my own mind. I think in prophecy, the meaning of the name is more important than the actual people involved. Although I can't say it doesn't cover both. And in some instances, it has to. But proper names translated in prophecy always yield tremendous amount of information. But here, Psalm 83, let me do it as quickly as possible. This is about the disabling of neighbors, and I think it is gradual, and I think it's in 2 approaches. And I think the reason that it's in 2 approaches and gradual is, I think I've got this someplace where I can see it better. You will notice up through verse 8 it names the countries involved. They're all close to Israel except one. And I suspect that one, which is here called Assyria, and Jim can probably knock me down on this, but I think it represents Iran. They're the ones that are pushing these people that live close. It's the one oddball in the list. It's not a close neighbor. Okay. Following that, this is a prayer by the Jewish people. Deliver us, Lord, because they want to push us into the sea. And so it said, deal with them. And even though there's a lot of words there, there's only 2 instances. They cover Judges 7 and Judges 4. Very different kinds of instance. One was Gideon. What happened with Gideon? The enemy destroyed himself. The other one, in Judges 4, Gideon was Judges 7. Mm-hmm. The Lord tells Israel to go out with a mighty, mighty, mighty army. And they destroy the powerful enemy. So in this psalm, you've got 2 things that are getting rid of Israel's enemies that are up close. One, Israel does things which makes the enemies destroy themselves. I think we've seen some of that happening. Number 2, Israel, by its own might, goes and destroys them. That's why I think this is a long-term prophecy, not a single event. I think this pictures everything that's been happening since Israel has become a state. It is getting rid of their nearby enemies in one of 2 ways, and the Lord's directing both ways. Okay. Last little note. Once that's done, Israel will be pretty secure. So what happens next? They've got enemies afar. And that's the objective of Ezekiel 38 and 39, the distant enemies of Israel. And it is in this battle that the Lord not only destroys them, but he destroys the rest of the world. Christendom will fall in that battle. Judaism will fall in that battle. Now, that last sentence should grab you. Christianity is no longer the Lord's. It was for 1845 years. Judaism is no longer the Lord's. Your house is left to you desolate, Jesus said, after 1845 years. But even though it was cast off, it was not destroyed. It's still around, bugging Jewish intellects. Judaism, Christianity, and everything else that is an enemy of the incoming kingdom will be destroyed in Ezekiel 38 and 39. I think I'm done. Big picture.
Well, you've gotten a pretty good picture of different views. You know, we've always tried to sort of present that. I know as when we do things in the Herald magazine, we try to present different viewpoints as long as they're supported by Scripture. And I think you hear here the same thing. We can look at the Scriptures and see things from different perspectives, and that's obviously the value of something like this. Before we get into the second part of our meeting, which is dealing with questions from you and a few other things, we're going to just take a break here. I'll let Bill do that for us, and then we'll come back together.
We're going to stand and sing a hymn. So who would have a hymn that'd like to, maybe the first verse, a long verse? Everybody stand up. We need to stretch our legs a little bit. Anybody have a hymn number? 168. How many verses is that? Let's just sing one.
I think it's short. There are 3 lines each.
That's good. Yeah. So we can all sit down now, and we're going to turn the meeting over back over to Brother Len. It's got questions now. There was those questions that were submitted, and we also have questions that the panel came up with. One more point before we start. I have a sign-up sheet for those that are going to stay from 5:30 to 7 for pizza. So we're only going to order pizzas for those that sign up. I know there's those that are hosting others at their home, and they're not going to have some dinner, and there are those that will have dinner at their home. So here's the sign-up sheet. We're just going to pass it around and just keep it going, and you can sign up if you're going to be here from 5:30 to 7 for pizza.
Well, I'm going to get a little more comfortable here. Sit down for this part. A lot of interesting things came up, and we have some questions. One of the things, and I wrote down some notes, one of the last things said about, purging out the rebels, and this was one of the questions I had posed to the panel. That's in Ezekiel 20:38. David kind of mentioned it. And the reason I wanted to pose that is because right now, as you look at Israel today, we've got 8 separate groups in Israel. You've got Reform Judaism. You've got Messianic Judaism. You got Hasidic Judaism. You have the Jews for Jesus. You have the Orthodox Jews. You have the agnostic Jews. You have the conservative Judaism. And then finally you have nominal Judaism. It's very interesting when you read Pastor Russell's work on predicting about what would happen with Israel before anything was happening. One of the things that he had the thought on was that only those that were the true Orthodox would be the inheritors of the kingdom when God was about to fight with them. So this scripture struck me in Ezekiel 20:38 that says, I would purge out the rebels. My question is, I think I know what David's answer is, but I'll let him give it again. And just when do you think this purging of the rebels takes place? Is it a one-time event? Is it something like this? Because we're still seeing Aliyah made. Even if we look at Israel today, during this time, since October 7th, the number of Jews in Israel increased to over 7 million now. And we saw Aliyah being made even despite all the troubles that's there. So it seems like it's still going the other way, and those that are returning maybe not are those religious. One, do you think that that's true, what was mentioned in Volume 3, that it's really the inheritors of the faithful in Israel are the Orthodox or the Hasidics or however we put that, versus Israel in general, because we've seen a lot since then. So that's one of those questions that the commentators give on TV that really want to express their opinion and not ask a question. But, okay. David, you mentioned that. I want to just clarify your thoughts on this purging out of the rebels as to what that is and when it happens.
I think there is a gradual purging, and it doesn't have to be obvious because you are decided to be a rebel by the way you react or do not react to the things the Lord is saying or doing. And so a lot of people can go to Israel and not be a rebel and not be a remnant, but events will make them into one or the other. So I think there is a gradual purging. The final purging is Ezekiel 38 and 39. That's where Judaism will be destroyed. No, I do not think the faithful remnant are the Hasidic Jews. Look at what happened at the first Advent. We have a miraculously good picture of what the Lord did. And he got criticized for it. What are you eating with those people for? They're adulterers, they're thieves, they don't obey the law, they're blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
And Jesus said, they're the ones I want. I don't think Jesus is coming to get the Hasidic Jew and say, you're going to be the basis of the kingdom. He'll say to the Hasidic Jew, I cast you off back in 33. You may have not got the point, but you ought to have it by now. And so he's going to take what appears to the rest of the world like the riffraff. Don't tell me that Tel Aviv is full of homosexuals. Don't tell me that those Jews are there for the money. Those people are probably the most teachable, and they may be the one that grab Messiah's skirts the minute he gets there.
Okay. Do you feel strongly about that, David?
No, not at all.
All right, Brother Joe.
I do not think the Hasidim would represent the best of the group, because they insist that Messiah was to come and bring the Jews back to the land, but the Jews are already coming out of the land. So they have been opposing a return to Israel. I think maybe more like the Orthodox, whether the ultra-Orthodox or the modern Orthodox is another question, are more likely to take the Bible seriously. But there's a variety among Jews. If you want four opinions, ask if you want four opinions, ask 3 Jews. But the scripture that I have in mind is Matthew 8, 11 and 12. And I say unto you that many shall come from the east and the west, and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom shall be cast forth into the outer darkness. There shall be the weeping and the gnashing of teeth. And so I think it's a case of those that have had no interest in living according to the principles that God has assigned, they will be cast out whether they claim to be religious or not. It'll be those that have been trying to practice the religion that I think will fall in line with the ancient worthies most quickly.
Okay. All right, Bob?
Well, as I look at this, I agree with Brother David. It's going to be a process. It's not going to be an event. But I also would say, I don't know that we would do it justice if we said it's going to be this group or that, or these two groups. It's just like our consecrations. As I look out, we've got a very diverse population here, all different levels of education, income, different races, great diversity, and it's based on individual hearts. And so you may find a secular Jew that sees this and embraces it. And, you know, I don't know that we can categorize it as a specific group.
Okay. Good. Yeah. I want to get through some of these questions we have, so I won't spend a lot of time commenting on this. I think generally, yeah, it's the return of the Jews to Israel is the important thing, and there's no blanket in my mind of saying it's only these kind that count. We're told that they're there, and however God divides that up, when the time comes, we'll wait and see. Here's a question which is important as we look at the events today. And the question is, how do we balance the perceived inhumanitarianism that's going on in this war? Notice I said perceived. And the anti-Semitism. How do we balance our thoughts and sympathies with those that are killed against the anti-Semitism that we see, which is more perhaps of interest to us in thinking about driving Jews back to Israel. Can we be too cold-hearted around this? Brother Jim, I'll start with you on this.
Well, I think easily we could be cold-hearted, but question is, in World War II, did they want to negotiate with Adolf Hitler, or did they have to get rid of him? And I think we have that situation with Hamas too. You don't have to want to get rid of the individuals, but you do have to get rid of the spirit of, we will kill all of Israel the moment we have a chance. In other words, if it's kill or be killed, Israel would have a right to eliminate those who have that philosophy.
Okay. Bob?
I'm not sure I really have anything to add to that. I mean, we always have to have God's perspective. So even though it seems cruel, we realize throughout history, like when they went in the promised land and he said, kill them, burn everything, and do it, and they didn't obey. I mean, we have to take a step of faith here. Not that we would support either side, but just say, this is God's will. And he's got a much better plan because everyone gets a resurrection.
Okay, good. David?
I hope I understand your question. When Jesus was ready to cast off Jerusalem, he wept over it. Mm-hmm. He knew what was going to happen there. They'd be eating their own children. And we can never lose our spirit of sympathy and mercy and so on. But don't confuse that with prophecy. And the same thing with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is not new. It's at least 2,000 years old, if not older than that. So, big deal, there's anti-Semitism. But what part does it play in prophecy? Well, you find me a scripture and then we'll deal with it.
Okay. Jim, yeah, go ahead.
By the way, we speak of anti-Semitism, but remember, the Arabs are Semites too. Mm-hmm. I prefer to use anti-Jewish.
Yeah, and that's a good point, right? There are promises, as we all know, that are given specifically, to the children of Abraham in general, and those include both. But the Jewish side is the one that's getting most of the play today. One of the things, as I think about this, it's a thing in general that we have to look at. Bible students historically have been conscientious objectors. Many of us served in that capacity 2 years. But I use this in broad terms. That doesn't mean that we are pacifists. Quakers are pacifists. Now, it may mean you don't pick up a gun, things like that, but it doesn't mean you don't think that war is sometimes necessary. It's just our participation in the fact that we've been given an opportunity to exercise our conscience in this line. I think as we look at history, we know that in many cases, there were things being done that were absolutely horrible. And anyone that says we shouldn't have gone in and tried to free the prison camps during World War II because we don't believe in violence that way. That war, without that war, wouldn't have happened. So I think we have to sort of put it in that perspective. That, as you heard said, there's always tragedy when these things happen. Yes, sympathy's got to go, but we have to look at the bigger picture of what this is accomplishing. And I think that's the case in this, is even though, yes, it's been a terrible humanitarian event, on the other side, we look at what's been attempted humanitarian-wise that is being prevented. I mentioned before, when it was Feed the World and all the food was going to waste on some pier out in Africa. The same things happen here. There's been humanitarian aid funded and tried to circulate into what's going on, but the prevention is not on Israel's side. The prevention is on the side of Hamas. So, again, the war is not pretty, and there'll be a day without war. But sometimes, as we know in this case, that I used a phrase many times, and those you've heard my talks on Israel know what I mean when I say there's two principles that drive the Middle East and Israel today. Number one is if the Arabs laid down their arms, there would be no more war. If Israel laid down its arms, there would be no more Israel. And that's the sad situation we have today. So, you're really boxed in the choice, and it's about that, I think, as we look at it. All right, let's we've got another question here on Ezekiel 38:11. So let's read that. Ezekiel 38:11. And thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to those who are at rest, who dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. The question is, with the events of the past 50 years, and especially of the present, how is it possible for Israel to dwell safely without walls? Bob, I think I'll start with you on this one.
Yeah, this is an interesting one that, in the past I thought, they're building walls in Israel. That's what it's talking about. Then they're going to be gone. I think we might have to look at this a little more symbolically. Traditionally, you had a walled city, and based on the thickness of those walls, they could be protected. So that you might go under siege, but if the walls held and you didn't starve or die of thirst, then you succeeded. That was protection. That's really what it represents. And I'm wondering, with these latest salvos that have come over on October 7th, on April 13th, on April 23rd, are we talking about protection and not physical walls? So they are living in unwalled villages right now. Traditional armies no longer just come in on the ground, but from overhead. Is that what they're talking about? And I think sometimes I have preconceived notions, you do as well, and maybe we challenge that. Is it talking about their defense? They're unwalled. Just a thought.
Very interesting. Okay. David?
I'm going to make a comment, but just sort of dismiss it as somebody ranting and raving and cogitating.
That's generally what we do, David.
Okay, fine. By the way, the one speaking here in 38:11 is not God. Well, he is speaking, but he's quoting somebody. He's quoting Gog. And Gog says, I will go up against the land of unwalled villages. I will go against those who are at rest that live securely, all of them living without walls and having no bars or gates. So, quite frankly, I rarely trust the observations or opinions of Israel's invaders. So they're the ones that are saying this.
Oh, so that's it. So you think it's not?
I know I'm not done.
Oh, okay. That was quite abrupt ending.
Yes, no, that would be terrible. Today, in Brother Bob's talk, he in passing gave a reference to Micah 7:11, which I've never seen before. I mean, I have. I've read the whole Bible a couple of times, but you know how that goes. It will be a day for building your walls. On that day will your boundary be extended. Now, isn't that an interesting concept? It's equating building walls with extending boundaries. I don't know what that means, but that should be in our discussion because it suggests that building walls is not so much of a defense. Well, maybe it is. Maybe they are defending themselves by enlarging their boundaries. I don't know. I'm just throwing that out. Chew on it. And a third text, you'll notice I'm giving no answer, I'm just giving observations. Zechariah 2. 4 and 5. Well, let me start with 3. Behold, the angel who was speaking with me was going out, and another angel was coming out to meet him, and said to him, Run, speak to that young man, saying, Jerusalem will be inhabited without walls, because of the multitude of men and cattle within it. In other words, you can't wall it in because it can't be contained. It's expanding too much. At least that's how I'm reading it. For I, declares the Lord, will be a wall of fire around her, and I will be the glory in her midst. So she'll always have a wall. His name is Yahweh. But walls seem to be boundaries, not protections. And again, these are observations, not proclamations.
Good. Okay. Jim?
Okay, I can tell you what I think, and that is that there may be several different ways in which Israel could become an unwalled nation. But perhaps the nation that might bring it about is Iran. The nastier they get, the more it scares the Arabs. They know that Israel isn't trying to take them over, but they know that Iran is. So it could be that all of the Arab nations surrounding Israel will be at peace with them, and that's what will be meant by the unwalled villages. That is one possibility, but I want to keep my eyes open too.
Did I call on you, Bob?
You started with
Oh,
him.
okay. Sorry for that. Another senior moment in there. Well, interesting. There are scriptures about this idea. 38:11, as we said, but I think that Isaiah 11:14, or not 14, Micah 7:11 and 14, as David mentioned, and Bob mentioned his talk. He didn't read 14, but 14 says, Feed thy people with thy rod, the flock of thine heritage, who dwell solitarily in the forest. In the midst of Carmel, let them feed in Bashan and Gilead, as in the days of old. So that seems that there would be, perhaps, yes, a continual Israeli-Arab war before the time of trouble that settles the land. And I think that's a possibility that goes also in Obadiah 18-20. Those scriptures seem to indicate perhaps that Israel does extend its borders prior to the time when the final battles, before the final battles, again, that they gained that land and that the Israeli-Arab wars are settled. So anyways, there you have our perspective on that one. This is always an interesting idea as to what the resolution of the Israeli-Arab route is. Iran is certainly a player. I think David, when he mentioned in Psalm 83, this startling sort of comment, stark comment, the Assyrian is with them. Why does that just get thrown in there? Where I think we see almost all I know would say that Iran is the Assyrian. And it's certainly true that Iran today is trying to rebuild the empire that existed under Cyrus. And that's something that I think Israel down the road, there will be a much broader presence with that. All right, let's go to another question here. This question is a broader one. It says, how big of a threat is Islam to the Western nations, especially regarding their gaining political power and requiring conversion to Islam by the masses? Do you see persecution of the church coming from a rise in Islam? I wanted to supplement this question with a thought. If you've never read Brother Streeter's books on Daniel, Brother Streeter puts a much bigger role for what at that time was called Mohammedism, now we call it Islam, as part of that picture in Daniel with the two-horned beast. So is Islam that is threatening Israel today, could it have a much broader reach in threatening the Western nations? And especially as we think now about the support of the Western nations toward Israel, perhaps that's even more pertinent. Anybody want to take a first crack at that? Okay, Jim, thanks for that halfway hand.
Okay. First, I'll read Revelation 16:13, and you know this is in connection with the 7 last plagues and towards the last plague, just before the last plague. And I saw coming out of the mouth of the dragon and out of the mouth of the beast and out of the mouth of the false prophet 3 unclean spirits, as it were frogs. Now, here is one of my heresies. I think that the beast would represent Christendom, particularly Roman Catholicism at the head. And out of the mouth of the false prophet, that expression, the false prophet, is interesting because the false prophet doesn't appear in Scripture until we get towards the last of the 7 last plagues. The image of the beast no longer appears after the first of the 7 last plagues. So I'm inclined to think that the false prophet may be the real big false prophet of the gospel age, Muhammad or Islam. I want to keep watching rather than closing my eyes on it. And then we have, in addition to the mouth of the beast and the false prophet, what's the other one here?
Dragon.
The dragon, yes. And that would be the civil power, which I think would be headed by the Russian group these days. It would be the atheism, the Marxism. And so that would be my concept of what's meant by the false prophet. Subject to change if the ideologies of the world change. And did I answer the question?
If you don't know, Jim, we don't know. Okay. Bob, why don't you want to take thoughts on that?
No.
Okay. Not required. David, any thoughts on that?
I would usually at this point say, as a conscientious objector to the fact that this question is not on our subject, I won't comment on it, but I do want to comment on one thing if I may.
Okay.
Brother Bob had a map on the board showing Shiite and Sunni. Which ones? The 10% were the problem makers, the Shiites. If Islam is this big worldwide problem, the Sunnis should be the one because they rule the world. So I don't think the answer to the question is yes, but it's not a valid question for our panel.
Yeah, I think it's one of those backward related questions because we're talking about Arabs and Islam, but right, not exactly pertinent. So, okay, I don't really have any threats on this other than saying if you want a perspective on Mohammedism in general, yeah, it is interesting to read what Brother Streeter wrote on that and why he looked at that as strongly as he did. So that's in his books if you have Bible study library or whatever.
Len?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Well,
You said you weren't going to say anything.
well, I know, but Brother David brought up the Shia Sunni thing, and when you look at it, most of the Sunnis want stability. Saudi Arabia and UAE, they want financial stability. They can't have it when they've got a bad neighbor in their backyard that's all the time threatening them. And even the Sunnis that are not speaking up, all those countries across North Africa that are Muslim but are not really vocal and speaking up against this, they want a stable environment, and they're looking to Israel now. Is this the stabilizing force? And if so, we'll kind of stand back and let them be the stabilizing force. And they are doing their dirty work by getting rid of these Shia militias and really incapacitating Iran. I understand that Iran had, during the attack on April 13th, shot most of their ballistic missiles at Israel. So they are almost out of those. And where do they get them? Well, they make them, but they also get components from Russia, which is another paper tiger. I mean, we thought that they should come in Ukraine and wipe them out. That's what they thought, too. Yeah. In post-haste, in 3 months, they'll have just run over the country, and it didn't happen. And now we find out how inept they are and how poor their planning is and how corrupt their leadership is and how they've, taken bribes and siphoned off money, and they kind of have a defense shell, but it's not really solid, except for nuclear weapons.
Yeah. One of the things that we really didn't talk about, I guess, with the panel or discuss to any great degree was, what has gone on with the Houthi rebels, and the fact that, they're closely tied with Iran. They're ones in Yemen that are being the annoying factor in trying to deal with the ships coming in and out. That whole thing started really back in 2011 when we had the Arab Spring, and a lot went forward then. They started fighting back in 2014 and seized the provinces. The old president was kicked out in 2015 because then Saudi Arabia, and then there were 8 mostly Sunni Arab states that were backed by the U.S., the UK, and France, and they began the airstrikes against the Houthis at that time. Saudi Arabia, you may recall, intervened, and then the Houthis stayed in control, but the bombs still fell there. Well, the reason I mention that is, Iran has had this relationship with the Houthi rebels before the war, but it really ramped up greatly just in September of 2023, which was just 2 weeks before the Hamas attack on Israel, interestingly enough. And when that happened, Saudi Arabia had praised the positive results of negotiations with the rebels there. But talks to end the war really kind of ceased when the Hamas attacked. But one of the points made is that in 2015, the president for the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, Clifford May, made a statement back then. Said only 2 world leaders have deciphered Iran's true intent, as we talked about here. One was King Salman of Saudi Arabia, and the other was Benjamin Netanyahu. And interestingly enough, they're the 2 now that are kind of in the forefront on this whole thing with the Houthi rebels in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is an interesting topic in itself, and their position as it relates to everything going on in the Middle East. All right, let's see, we'll get a couple more questions. This one's a little different. Is there any significance of Gaza in the end times. Anyone a thought on that? Gaza itself, what role does that play in end times, if anything? Jim?
No, no opinion. Go ahead.
No opinion. Okay, Bob?
Well, when I look at the Moses and Ezekiel maps of what the land will be, there's chunks missing. Lebanon, part of Syria, Gaza, and West Bank. Those are supposed to be Israel.
Right.
So the question is, will they be, what's going to be the solution for Gaza? I heard what they're trying to do right now is completely evacuate one of the cities in the north before they come in and totally purge it of Hamas. And I don't know what their strategy is, if they're going to work their way down or what, but obviously those are puzzle pieces that are not yet known. Lebanon's interesting because it's basically in chaos. There's no government, is almost non-existent, no rule of law. You got terrorists embedded there. And that's another one that this war, because they've attacked Israel, there may be another expansion there. So are the pieces going to come back as a result of this? And I would just say, watch the news and listen to the feeds from Israel.
Okay. We've got a couple others here sort of related. See what there's anything to say about these. What do you expect after Hamas is defeated? That's an assumption. I think we probably all know that eventually Israel will win, at what cost, but what do you expect to happen if and after Hamas is defeated? Jim?
My guess is, and that it is a guess, is that West Bank and the Hezbollah up in Lebanon will be the two fronts. And will it be one at a time or both at the same time? We'll have to wait and see.
Jim, you had, in fact, I use your scripture a lot, scripture that talks about the fact, do not make covenants with those in the land given to Moses. Could you elaborate on that? Maybe
Okay, thou shalt make no covenant with the people of the land. And whenever Israel has done that, it's come back to bite them, including their covenant where it was that the UN would protect the border between Israel and Egypt. And they found that it was there to protect Egypt from Israel, but not to protect Israel from Egypt.
Jim, that scripture just for everybody is Exodus 30. Is that the one?
Could be.
I thought it was. I don't think it's Exodus 30.
Well, let's see.
Maybe after that. Exodus 33, maybe?
Entirely possible. Should be in there somewhere. I'm looking under covenant in the concordance, see if I can find it before you do.
Where's your Google? Right? I just think it's something that some of you could take it. It's a good scripture.
Judges 2:2.
No, that's not the one. No, this is one in Exodus.
Exodus
20, yeah, you said it. 23:32. That sounds right. We're just testing you to see if you're saying
That's the one.
Okay, you want to read that, Jim? I think that's important to keep in your back pocket.
Yeah.
33 as well, yeah.
Okay. Thou shalt make no covenant with them, not with their gods. They shall not dwell in thy land, lest they make thee to sin against me. For if thou serve their gods, it will surely be a snare unto thee. And it was.
Yeah, and it still is, right? I mean, this, when you think about it, they're making covenants around the land and giving it to those who don't own it. And I think, as was mentioned, that's something that is going to plague them until they get through that. So, all right, a couple of things I want to look at before our time expires. One is, how do we show support for Israel without becoming political? Is that even possible? David, I'm going to start with you on this one.
Gee, thanks.
Yeah, that's all right. We'll need to correct some of the things probably. So
I don't think there's any reason to become political. If we understand that the Israel that exists as a unit there now is not what is being prepared for the kingdom, then the politics of Israel and the prophecy of Israel are two separate and distinct things. One's dealing with people who are rebels, the other is dealing with people who will become the faithful remnant.
okay.
And the best way to avoid politics is say, what scripture do you have in mind? And that, by the way, is one of my soapboxes. Please don't talk about things without supporting scriptures.
That's great advice. Yes. That would cut about half the conversations that I think we have sometimes. Bob?
Well, in deference to David, we have Psalm 122:6. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. We have no more powerful tool in our arsenal than to go to the Lord. Period. So we don't need to get political. We don't need to go down to demonstrations, but we do need to confirm our faith through prayer.
Suppose somebody asks you, how do you feel? You're a college student. Okay, you're on one of the college campuses that's demonstrating. And they ask you, how do you stand on this issue? How would you answer? Jim?
I'm for Israel, and accepted it, and I'm going to get beat up.
Brilliant. Okay, I didn't expect that answer. But Jim went to U of M, don't forget. Okay, David, any thought on that one?
Keep going.
Okay. Bob?
Well, God says the land is mine. He says he gives it to whom he pleases, and he has deeded it to Israel, his people.
Yeah.
Not a popular answer on college campus right now, but it's the truth.
Okay, David.
Let me quote Brother Leon Norby,
Okay.
not on this subject, but on any subject you get in trouble with.
Okay.
That's a long and marvelous subject. When you've got a couple hours, let's sit down and talk about it.
It's really good. Interesting enough, Gretchen and I walk the dog every morning in the park. There's a man-made lake, and we walk around Fountain Park. Some of you have been to our house know where it is. But in the last few weeks, there always has been Jehovah's Witnesses setting up their things, but the last few weeks there's been more of them. We've gotten to know them pretty good, enough that I can call them by their first names, and we have discussions, and some of them are good, some of them not. But I asked them, I said, let me ask you a question in a friendly manner. And this is the way I like to talk to them. How do you answer when someone asks you? You got things out here about the end times and things like, how do you answer when someone says, how do you view Israel? What's happening in Israel? And she thought for a minute, and she just said, well, God is punishing for rejecting Messiah. And I said to her, didn't that already happen? And now he's regathering them, and said, no, well, he's still punishing them for rejecting Messiah. It's an interesting thought, because not everybody sees this subject the same way. Young people tend to be very caught up in movements. I must admit that I was early on that avenue before Brother Adam Miskowitz threw a real good question in my face that changed my whole viewpoint of things. But it was, during the war, the Vietnam War, and you found out there was a lot of protests going on about this and about that in the war, and some of the people were very serious. I mean, I worked with some of the COs that they withheld their tax money that was going to the war, even, but others were there to demonstrate because that's what they wanted to do. It wasn't about the cause. It was about demonstrating. And one of my favorite folk singers of those days was a guy named Phil Oakes. Wrote some wonderful songs, but generally anti-war songs. After the war was over, he hanged himself, just like Judas. He hanged himself, and he left a note that said, "There's nothing left to protest." Well, it told me a lot. It kind of woke me up and said, this is not what it's supposed to be about. And I think that's kind of what we get today with the demonstrations. As you know, half the people that are arrested aren't even students at the university. There's some kind of outside agitators. Now, everybody's got an opinion. They're paid or funded by George Soros or somebody. And, there's a lot of conspiracies around that, which I personally am not subscribed to. I don't believe politicians two of them can agree, let alone 50 of them, to make a conspiracy. So the point is that these are short-term kinds of things, and whether it was a few years ago, we had, not that it wasn't important, but we had the whole BLM movement, we had LBGQ. It's not about the cause, it's about the demonstration. And we see that with Israel now, that it's about the demonstration. I don't really believe most of them really care that this is going on. They never demonstrated for some of the other stuff that was going on, but this is one that's popular. So that's kind of how we have to look at this. And if someone says, "How do you feel about it?" I said, well, the scriptural thing is we believe Israel is God's people, and that land is theirs. It doesn't mean that we support every iota of what they're doing, but they are not to be removed from that land, and I'm glad to share the scriptures with you that talk about that. So anyways. All right, one last question. I think it's important for us to kind of have a call to action at the end of everything, and what do we do with all this knowledge? There was major work done earlier on by some with the Israel appointment with Destiny. That was done by, spearheaded by Brother Ken Rawson. George Tabak did for this cause. We don't seem to have anything like that going now. Is this an opportunity for Bible students to sort of say, what can we do, or should we be doing something to proclaim the promises to Israel and what it means as a general witness idea? What do you think about that, Bob?
Well, this is an interesting question. Very, very timely as well. I work at the Dawn, and we have found that anything with the word Israel on it in the last year has gone absolutely ballistic. I mean, we're doing thousands of tracts and thousands of booklets. That's the most in-demand subject. And I kind of, helping manage the plan, I track, what moves and what doesn't. And Israel is on everyone's radar right now. So it's a wonderful opportunity. And if you go, I think on, Bill, did you put them on the back table? We've got Israel Fulfilling Bible Prophecy. We've got a little track there that just came out. It's an opportunity, but you don't have to be a publishing house to do this. Your class can do this. You can do a public witness, and it will be very keenly observed. So you have a unique opportunity to proclaim God's message. And this is the hot topic right now because of the war, because of everything else happening. It's very much on people's minds, and they are calling and mailing and emailing and asking us for anything regarding Israel. That's what a lot of them say. Just give me everything you got on Israel. And so we do that. So it's a unique opportunity, but this is a limited time offer. We don't know how long the attention span of the world will be on Israel, but right now, you have an opportunity.
Okay, Jim, any thoughts?
Okay, I think that's good. And just thinking, our message should not be Armageddon and Israel, but rather Israel and the kingdom.
Okay, good. All right, David, thoughts on this?
Yes and no. Just kind of a philosophical thought. I remember when I was young, particularly, brethren would say, I'm working on patience now. And the other brother said, I'm working on temper right now. And it finally occurred, I think, to many of us, that we don't pick what we're working on. You may want to work on patience, but the Lord says, no, you got to work on phileo. And so I am sure that the Lord is going to supply occasions, and this may be one of them, but He will also supply the ideas on what to do with them. As much as has been obvious today about we've got so many details and we don't know how to glue them together. I mean, this is fine to go out and witness about Israel, but what are you going to say? And until the Lord puts something in your head that this is what we ought to say, just keep your mouth shut.
Okay. Bob?
A little bit different. If you don't want to keep your mouth shut, we have tracts, brochures, and booklets. Chicago has them. It's not unique to the Dawn. And avail yourself. So if you want those materials, if your class is not inclined to do their own, avail yourself. So these messages are out there. Some of these booklets have been written. The tract that we're passing around is very recent, but some of them have been out there 10 years, so they are not lightly put together, I'll put it that way.
Yeah. I think one of the problems we have in our day, I say problems, maybe it's a good one, is the response to mass messages. It's just really not there anymore. For one, people don't want to go and hear mass messages. They like to get stuff online, whatever, and I think there are a lot of opportunities. So inclined, I've seen it on brethren putting stuff up on Facebook and other mediums